All right, let's just dive right into this. For all of you training to be the next generation of surgeons and physicians, our future MBBS graduates out there, I want you to reframe how you look at the operating room. It's not just a place for anatomical correction, right? It's a physiological battlefield. So welcome to the perioperative crucible. In today's explainer, we're going to master the absolute high-stakes obstacle course that is patient nutrition and fluid therapy. Think about it like this. How do we actually prevent physiological collapse in a surgical patient? Because the reality is, surgery is basically controlled trauma. To the human body, a scalpel slice triggers the exact same severe metabolic stress as getting hit by a car. It's our job to arm you with the clinical tenets to combat this intense catabolism. If we drop the ball here, the patient's physiological equilibrium totally collapses. And honestly, your flawless surgical technique won't mean a thing. So here is our roadmap for today. We're tracking the patient's journey chronologically. 1. Preoperative nutritional optimization. 2. Enteral versus parenteral nutrition. 3. Navigating refeeding syndrome. And 4. Fluid and electrolyte management. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, Preoperative Nutritional Optimization, or, as I like to call it, preparing for battle. The trauma of surgery unleashes this massive flood of stress hormones and inflammatory cytokines. This metabolic stress is basically systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or SIRS. To heal that wound you just created, the body goes into overdrive, furiously breaking down its own glycogen, fat, and protein stores just to dump glucose and amino acids into the bloodstream. If your patient rolls into the OR with their protein reserves already running on fumes, you're looking at delayed wound healing, a compromised immune response, and a seriously defective gut barrier. And this is exactly why the official ESPEN guidelines are so absolutely crucial to our strategy. It's all about identifying high nutritional risk early on. We screen everyone, and if they flag as high risk, our standard approach goes right out the window. So who are these high-risk patients? Well, they're folks who've lost more than 10 to 15% of their body weight in the last 6 months. Maybe their BMI is under 18.5, or they score greater than 5 on the NRS 2002 screening. For these patients, we don't just rush them to the table. Actually, scratch that. We completely hit pause. We postpone the surgery for 2 to 6 weeks. During that time, we do trimodal prehabilitation. That's a rigorous regimen of nutritional therapy, aiming for 1.2 grams of protein per kilo, plus physical exercise and psychological support to drastically slow down the loss of lean body mass. Now, fast forward to the night before surgery. We are officially tossing out that outdated nil-by-mouth from midnight dogma. Under modern ERAS protocols, enhanced recovery after surgery, starving your patient is literally a clinical sin. Patients can and should eat solids up to 6 hours before anesthesia, and crucially, they need clear fluids and a carb-loaded drink up to 2 hours prior. This isn't just to make them feel better. Carb loading actively crushes post-operative insulin resistance. It's a real game changer. Moving right along to Section 2, Enteral versus parenteral nutrition, the golden rule. We're in the post-operative phase now, and we've got a massive decision to make. How do we deliver nutrients safely? The clinical maxim you need to permanently burn into your brain is simply this: if the gut works, use it. Enteral nutrition, which is feeding right through the GI tract, is our absolute gold standard. You want to start this early, ideally within 24 hours post-surgery. Why? Because putting nutrients in the gut preserves the mucosal barrier, it stops intestinal atrophy dead in its tracks, and it significantly drops infection rates. But a quick word of caution, you gotta advance gradually. Start low, like 10 to 20 milliliters per hour, just to build up that intestinal tolerance. But what about parenteral nutrition? Feeding straight into the veins. Listen, this is your absolute last resort. It's strictly reserved for when the gut is a total no-go. Think severe obstructions, prolonged ileus, or high-output fistulas. Yes, it's life-saving, but it opens the door to massive risks. We're talking severe catheter-related bloodstream infections, also known as line sepsis, and really serious liver complications like hepatic steatosis and cholestasis. Bottom line, only use it when you absolutely have to. All right, let's jump to Section 3, Navigating Refeeding Syndrome, the paradoxical threat. This is the climax of our physiological journey. Refeeding syndrome is this hidden, paradoxical danger that hits exactly when we finally reintroduce calories to a starving body. It literally turns our life-saving nutritional therapy into a massive systemic threat. And it's shockingly common. Studies show it happens in anywhere from 17% up to a staggering 52% of ICU patients. The folks most at risk, severely cachectic patients, oncology patients, or honestly, anyone who's been chronically malnourished.
You absolutely have to understand the mechanism here. During starvation, the body quietly burns through its total stores of phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium just to stay alive. Then, boom, you introduce food. That sudden hit of glucose triggers a massive spike in insulin, and that insulin violently forces those scarce remaining electrolytes rapidly inside the cells to fuel ATP production. Suddenly, the extracellular blood volume is completely stripped bare of these vital minerals.
And that intercellular shift leaves the bloodstream completely barren. What does that actually look like on the ward? Absolute catastrophic clinical fallout. Severe hypophosphatemia literally strips the diaphragm of its strength, leading to respiratory failure. Low potassium and magnesium? They trigger lethal QTc prolongation and cardiac arrest. You'll even see extreme thiamine deficiency presenting as Wernicke encephalopathy, so ataxia and severe memory loss. Plus, because insulin causes sodium retention, your patient can rapidly develop fatal pulmonary edema. It's a total disaster.
So, the big takeaway here is that you must anticipate this syndrome. If a patient is malnourished, you don't just hook up a giant bag of high-calorie nutrition. You start low, you advance incredibly slowly, and you aggressively monitor and supplement phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium the whole way through.
And finally, Section 4, Fluid and Electrolyte Management, Achieving Stabilization. You've fed them properly, but now precision fluid management is what dictates whether they walk out of the hospital or end up back in the ICU. I want every single one of you to memorize this number, 25 to 30. 25 to 30 milliliters per kilogram per day. That is your absolute gold standard calculation for maintenance IV fluids in adults. But hey, volume isn't everything, right? Composition really matters. You've got to pair that volume with strict limits. Cap that sodium at 70 to 100 millimoles per day, and supplement potassium at about 1 millimole per kilo per day. Oh, and perhaps the most important rule of IV fluids? Cut the lines. Discontinue the IV the exact moment the patient is awake, free of nausea, and can actually drink. IV fluids are drugs. Do not just leave them running out of sheer habit. You also need to recognize the extreme danger of standard 0.9% saline. Flooding a patient with it, that's an archaic practice. The massive chloride load causes hyperchloremic acidosis. Even worse, it causes systemic and splanchnic edema, literally swelling of the gut. That swelling decreases mesenteric blood flow, triggers paralytic ileus, and is a major culprit behind devastating anastomotic dehiscence. Basically, your beautiful surgical connection just bursts open.
So, instead of just guessing with bags of saline, modern surgery relies on goal-directed fluid therapy, or GDFT. While in the OR, we use advanced hemodynamic monitoring, things like stroke volume variation, to precisely guide our fluid boluses. We give exactly what the heart can pump to optimize cardiac output, without overloading the tissues with even a single extra drop.
And once they're recovering in the high-dependency unit, you don't guess with electrolyte replacements either. You have to rely on your hospital's standardized, precision protocols to safely correct those potassium, magnesium, and phosphate imbalances. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with the core objective of all your clinical interventions on the surgical ward. What is the ultimate, big picture goal of our fluid therapy? It's this: aim for a near zero fluid balance. The SBN data is super clear here. Patients managed in a state of near zero fluid balance saw a staggering 59% reduction in their risk of developing complications, and their hospital stay dropped by over 3 days. Look, your job isn't just to cut and sew, it's to protect the physiological equilibrium. By mastering nutrition, respecting the gut, anticipating refeeding syndrome, and nailing that zero fluid balance, you ensure your patient actually survives the perioperative crucible. So future doctors, my question to you is this: are you ready to treat the entire physiology of your patient, or are you just here to cut out the pathology? We'll see you in the next explainer.